Sometimes, photographs capture more than faces. They hold on to moments of memories, and, sometimes, things that were never meant to be seen. Things that stand just outside the edges of our vision, silent, waiting, watching. In the autumn of 1891, a respected London family posed for what should have been an ordinary portrait. A beautiful arrangement, a proud father, a gentle mother, 3 children placed with the formal elegance expected of the Victorian era. The photographer, a master of his craft, prepared the glass plate with care. Everything was perfect, until it wasn't. When the image was developed, something unexpected appeared. A faint, translucent figure stood behind the youngest boy, clearly visible, though no such person had ever been present. Not during the setup, not during the capture, not at all. Yet there it was, the 4th child, pale, still, unsmiling, and entirely unknown to the family. It wasn't a blur. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was detailed, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, eyes forward, looking directly into the lens, as if it knew, as if it wanted to be seen. This is not a ghost story told around a campfire. This is a photograph, one that exists, one that has been tested, scanned, dissected, and yet remains unexplained. What you're about to hear is more than a mystery. It's a case that has challenged scientists, historians, and skeptics for over a century. If you're ready to step into the shadow between reality and the unknown, you've come to the right place. Subscribe to Grave of the Shadows for more true cases that defy logic. Have your own theory? Comment below. We read every one, because this story is just beginning. The year was 1891. London was a city of gas lamps, cobblestone streets, and thick fog rolling in from the Thames. The Victorian era was nearing its peak, a time of deep curiosity and even deeper superstition. Science was advancing rapidly, yet the shadow of the unknown still clung to the edges of everyday life. Electricity was new, photography even newer. To many Victorians, cameras were more than machines. They were mirrors to the soul. The belief was widespread. When a lens captured your image, it might also capture your essence, something beyond skin and bone, something eternal. It wasn't just folklore. It was whispered as fact by grieving mothers, clergymen, even doctors. Some covered mirrors after a death. Others refused to be photographed at all. What if the camera didn't just take your likeness, but took part of you with it? Spiritualism flourished during this time. Seances were held in parlors. Mediums filled theaters. Death was not considered the end, it was a veil, the thin one, and photography, some believed, had the power to pierce it. The process itself was strange and alchemical. Photographers worked with dangerous chemicals, collodion, silver nitrate, ether. Glass plates were coated, exposed, and rushed into darkrooms while still wet. Ghostly images could appear from nothing. Blurs, streaks, flares of light. Sometimes just accidents, but sometimes not. Even the most rational minds of the time were drawn into the mystery. The newly founded Society for Psychical Research counted among its members respected professors and scientists. Men trained to doubt, now obsessed with the idea that cameras might reveal what human eyes could not. It was in this strange crossroads of science and spirit, logic and fear, that one photograph would spark a century of debate. It was taken on an overcast afternoon in October 1891. It would become known as the Ashworth portrait, and it would haunt everyone who saw it. The Ashworths were not famous, not royal, not cursed. They were simply a well-to-do Victorian family living on the outskirts of London in a red brick estate framed by ivy-covered walls and autumn leaves. Henry Ashworth was a banker, stern but fair. His wife Margaret, gentle and soft-spoken, came from a line of scholars. They had 3 children: William, age 15, Eleanor, 12, and little Charles, just 7. They were, by every measure, a portrait of Victorian respectability. On the afternoon of October 21, 1891, they gathered in the drawing room to sit for a formal photograph. The weather was gray, the kind of cool, still air that made time feel slower. It was a moment meant to be preserved, a tradition, a legacy, a quiet snapshot of family life before the turn of the century. The man behind the camera was Mr. Elias H. Harrison, a respected itinerant photographer known for his meticulous work. He traveled with a heavy wooden box of equipment, a large-format bellows camera, polished brass lens, and thick glass plates stored in a velvet-lined case. He was not a man prone to theatrics. He believed in chemistry, timing, and precision. The wet collodion process he used was complicated. First, a glass plate had to be evenly coated with a sticky chemical mixture, made light-sensitive with silver nitrate, and then exposed in the camera while still wet. Once exposed, the plate had to be rushed into a darkroom and developed immediately. No room for error, no time for tricks. The Ashworths were arranged carefully. Margaret sat center, hands folded. Henry stood behind her with one hand resting gently on her shoulder. William to the right, Eleanor to the left, and Charles sat cross-legged on a patterned rug just in front of them. It was a classic Victorian composition. As Harrison removed the lens cap, he reminded them, no movement. The exposure would last approximately 30 seconds. Long enough for eyes to blink, for breaths to hold, for ghosts to wander. But no one moved. Not a single twitch. To the living eye, the moment passed in silence. Nothing unusual happened. But photography doesn't care about silence. It captures everything, even the things we do not see. And when the plate was developed, it would show not 5 figures, but 6. When Harrison stepped into the attic darkroom, the house was quiet. The only sounds were the faint crackle of coal from the fireplace below and the gentle slosh of chemicals in glass trays. The collodion plate, still wet and delicate, was lowered into the developer. He watched, as he always did, for the image to emerge. At first, everything appeared as expected. Henry, tall and composed. Margaret, hands folded, eyes solemn. William, upright. Eleanor, still. Charles, small and neat, sitting cross-legged on the floor. But then, there was something else. Just behind Charles, slightly to the left as if crouching low, stood a figure. A child. Pale. Thin. Translucent. Wearing clothing out of style even for the time. A high collar. Knickerbockers. Hair parted neatly down the center. Hands folded in front, mimicking the posture of the others. He wasn't blurry or distorted. He wasn't hidden in shadows or light flares. He was simply there. Harrison froze. For a moment, he considered a trick of the chemicals. A double exposure. A reflection. A flaw. But none of that made sense. The angle didn't match any reflective surface. The clarity was too precise. And the other plates from the same batch. Clean. He pulled the plate closer under the ruby-red glow. The 6th figure had eyes that seemed to look directly at him. He checked his camera, the lens, the shutter. He went over every mechanical detail, the exposure time, the angle, the position of the family. Everything was correct. The only thing that wasn't was this boy. He had not been there. Harrison would have seen him. Someone would have noticed. But no one had. Still, the photograph told a different story. Told the truth. And the truth had 6 faces. The next morning, Harrison returned to the Ashworth home with the developed plate tucked carefully between sheets of linen. He didn't explain much, only that they should all see it together. He laid the photograph on the drawing room table. The family gathered around. For a moment, no one spoke. Margaret's face went pale. She stumbled back, one hand over her mouth, the other clutching the edge of the table. Henry's brow furrowed as his jaw tightened. William and Eleanor leaned closer, silent, confused. And then Charles looked up, calm, curious, unafraid. "Oh," he said, "that's Arthur." The room fell into stillness. Henry turned toward his son. "Who?" "Arthur," Charles repeated with the ease of a child explaining something obvious. "He was playing with me while we waited." "But you couldn't see him," Margaret whispered. "Charles, what do you mean?" The boy shrugged. "He's nice. He was cold, though. He held my hand when the picture was taken." Harrison stood frozen. The adult stared, unsure whether to laugh, cry, or scream. There was no Arthur. No friend. No guest. No one by that name in their family, their circle, or their memory. Yet Charles spoke with certainty. Not like a child lying. Not like a child imagining. Like someone recalling a simple fact. He began describing Arthur. Blonde hair, shiny shoes, a scratch on his right knee. The same details matched the figure in the photograph with eerie precision. The Ashworths were shaken. But Charles? He simply smiled and asked if Arthur would be in the next picture too. Sometimes the scariest thing is not when a child sees something you can't. It's when they act like it's always been there. Elias Harrison wasn't a man given to superstition. He believed in lenses and light, in chemicals and controlled variables. But something about the image, that sixth figure, gnawed at him. It wasn't just the impossibility. It was the precision, the presence, the way the child looked directly into the lens, as if he knew. The following week, Harrison returned to the Ashworth home, not with his camera, but with questions. He asked Henry about visitors, neighbors, servants' children, anyone who might have wandered in during the shoot. Henry shook his head. No one. The room had been closed. Everyone accounted for. Still, Harrison couldn't let it go. He began digging, first in parish records, then through dusty land deeds and forgotten archives at the local registry. The Ashworth estate, as it turned out, hadn't always been a home. Before it became a private residence, the land held a modest boys' school, the Winford Academy, established in 1847. A single-building institution with 30 pupils, run by 2 aging schoolmasters and funded by donations from London philanthropists. The school's history was unremarkable. Until 1862, that winter, an outbreak of diphtheria swept through the school. 6 boys died within 2 weeks. The school shut its doors permanently soon after. Most of the records were boxed and left to rot in the church basement. Among the names listed in the death ledger was one that stopped Harrison cold. Arthur Petton, age 7. Date of death, October 12, 1862. Exactly 29 years and 9 days before the photograph was taken. The church records even included a brief physical description. Blonde hair, light eyes, small for his age, wore second-hand boots. Harrison sat in the candlelit archive room, comparing the notes to what he remembered in the image. The parted hair, the size, the eyes, the shoes. It matched. Every single detail matched. Back at the Ashworth home, Charles was still speaking to his unseen friend. He told his mother Arthur liked the way the house smelled now, but missed the old bell in the hallway. There had never been a bell in the Ashworth era, but a bell rope had once hung just outside the study, used to call boys in from the schoolyard. It had been removed decades ago during renovation. That night, Margaret Ashworth wrote in her journal, "Charles spoke of things he could not know. I no longer believe this is imagination. Something else is with us." The past, it seemed, had not been buried, only forgotten. And Arthur? Arthur had waited almost 30 years for someone who could see him. The photograph had already disturbed the family. But it was Harrison, the man behind the lens, who couldn't sleep. The boy's image haunted him, not because it was blurry or ghost-like, but because it was perfect, sharp, present, real. So he made a decision. If this was to be dismissed, it must first be understood. He contacted Dr. Frederick Myers, co-founder of the Society for Psychical Research, a respected scholar known for investigating claims that science had not yet explained, but refused to mock. Myers agreed to visit. He didn't come alone. Joining him were 2 colleagues, Dr. Richard Hodgson, famed skeptic and fraudbuster, Edmund Gurney, a pioneer in early psychical studies. They arrived in early November 1891, bringing with them more than curiosity. They brought gear, precision thermometers, magnetometers, barometers, even a portable photographic lab. Nothing was to be left to chance. The tests began immediately. The team recreated the original photograph under strict protocols. The same room, the same furniture, the same family positioning. Charles sitting cross-legged on the rug. The glass plates were marked, numbered, sealed in wax. Chemicals were prepared under supervision. Exposure times were timed by pocket chronometers. 2 independent witnesses, A neighbor and a local doctor watched every step. 5 photographs were taken. In 4 of them, the figure of Arthur appeared. But it didn't stop there. With each new exposure, Arthur's image became more defined. The posture changed slightly. His position shifted from one frame to the next. In one image, he looked down. In the next, he faced the lens. And in the final photo, his hand appeared to hover just above Charles's shoulder, but cast no shadow. The investigators were stunned. But they hadn't come just for photos. The instruments told a story too. Magnetometers registered small but distinct fluctuations in the room, especially during the moments Charles claimed Arthur was nearby. Thermometers detected sudden drops of 2 to 3 degrees Celsius localized in specific corners of the room, always near Arthur's supposed position. In one instance, the air pressure dropped subtly, even though the windows and doors were sealed. Hodgson, the skeptic, was the most disturbed. He ran his own set of tests. He brought his own camera, his own plates, his own chemicals. He personally supervised every moment. The result? Arthur appeared again. There was no room left for human error. No trick of the eye. No sleight of hand. Charles, meanwhile, grew more involved. He began speaking softly to the corner of the room. He said Arthur was glad people finally noticed him. That he didn't want to scare anyone, he just didn't want to be alone. He said Arthur liked the clicking sound of the camera. That it woke him up. The researchers documented everything. Myers filled 47 pages of handwritten notes, including direct quotes from Charles, temperature logs, and photo comparisons. He noted Arthur's facial expressions grew more human across exposures, not lifeless but animated. One entry read, "The boy Charles exhibits no signs of fantasy or imagination. His descriptions are consistent. His effect is calm. He speaks of Arthur as if speaking of a brother he has always known." Even more unsettling were the recorded whispers. Using a primitive wax cylinder recorder, they captured low sounds during the sessions. Faint, indistinct, but real. When replayed, several syllables emerged. Soft, childish. Words like cold, Charles, and Bell. Linguists later analyzed the accent, matching it to a dialect common to the Essex countryside in the 1860s. Harrison watched all of this with growing unease. He had started as an observer. Now he was part of something no one could explain. Myers, in his final report, didn't declare ghosts real. He didn't claim the supernatural. What he wrote was even more chilling. Something appeared that should not exist, yet it exists, and it appears to respond. A week later, Harrison returned to the Ashworth home, not as a photographer this time, but as a witness. The society had concluded its investigation. Instruments packed, notes archived, but something lingered. Charles still spoke with Arthur. Only now, Arthur didn't wait for the camera. One afternoon, as Charles played quietly in the corner with wooden blocks, Margaret Ashworth watched from her chair. He paused, looked to his left and said, "You don't need to hide. They believe now." Later that evening, Harrison brought one final glass plate. Not for science, just for curiosity. He had brought no setup, only a camera, the same corner, and Charles sitting alone. He exposed the plate. 30 seconds. Nothing unusual. Until the image developed. Arthur was back. Sharper. Clearer. His face was not distant this time, it was focused. Eyes looking not at the camera, but at Charles. And his hand? Resting gently on Charles's shoulder. There was no blurring. No ghost-like distortion. The contact appeared real. Detailed fingers, soft pressure. But once again, no shadow. Charles looked at the image and smiled. "He's not scared anymore," he said. "He knows you're listening now." Margaret wrote that night. "There is a stillness in the house, but not an emptiness. I hear footsteps where no one walks. I feel warmth in cold rooms. I am no longer afraid. But I am no longer certain where the living end and the dead begin." The ghost wasn't fading. He was becoming closer. And in that photo, the final one Harrison would ever take in that house, Arthur wasn't just visible. He was present. Weeks passed. The experts left. The instruments were packed away. But Arthur remained. What had begun as a terrifying anomaly slowly wove itself into the Ashworths' daily lives. Not loudly, not violently, but quietly, almost gently. Charles spoke with Arthur often, usually in a whisper. At first, Margaret tried to discourage it, worried it was imagination. But the conversations were too specific, too personal. He spoke of things no child could know. The school's old classroom layout, the name of a teacher long deceased, even the verses they used to recite in Latin. And every detail, when checked, proved to be accurate. The Ashworths began to adapt. Margaret started keeping a diary, not of dreams or fears, but of occurrences. On November 18th, the study door opened on its own. On the 22nd, the piano in the parlor produced a single melody, a four-note tune Charles said Arthur loved. On the 26th, books fell from a shelf one by one, spelling out the name ARTH. There was no aggression, no poltergeist chaos, just presence. Sometimes the house would feel warmer in one room than the others, despite no fire. Other times, the temperature would drop around Charles, and he would smile and say, "Arthur's cold again," Margaret, once terrified, wrote in her diary. It is as though the veil between worlds has thinned, and through that veil walks a child who never meant to frighten, only to be remembered. Henry remained skeptical, though quieter now. William avoided the topic entirely. Eleanor, curious and frightened, began asking questions, not to disprove Arthur's existence, but to understand it. And Harrison? He returned often, not with equipment, but with tea. He spoke less and listened more. The photograph had changed him. He no longer sought proof. He had found something more powerful: acceptance. Arthur's appearances in photographs became less frequent, but more detailed when they did occur. A hand on a banister, a shape in the mirror, a reflection in the window that matched no one in the room. It wasn't just Charles who noticed anymore. Visitors occasionally mentioned the boy in the hallway, assuming it was one of the Ashworth children. But he never showed up in group photos, never responded when called. The family stopped correcting them. Arthur had, in his own way, become part of the household. And Charles, once a child with an invisible friend, was now a boy growing up with something no one could define. It wasn't haunting. It wasn't healing. It was simply presence. A memory that walked. A silence that watched. A child who had been left behind, and finally found someone who listened. Elias Harrison was not the only one changed by the events in the Ashworth home. Dr. Myers, after reviewing every image, every instrument reading, every whispered account from Charles, began to wonder whether the phenomenon was not just photographic but biological. What if the boy was not simply appearing in the camera? What if Charles was the key? The more researchers observed the case, the more one detail stood out. Arthur only appeared clearly in photographs when Charles was present. Not Margaret, not William, not Eleanor. That pattern wasn't unique to the Ashworth case. As Harrison began corresponding with other photographers across Europe, he discovered similar stories. Children claiming to see things adults could not. Ghostly figures appearing in rooms only when children were around. Photographs taken by professionals that developed images no one remembered witnessing. Always, the common thread was a child. Myers proposed a theory that would become one of the most controversial ideas in early parapsychology. There exists a threshold of perception, a subliminal space, to which children remain naturally open. As the mind matures, this access closes. Rationality replaces receptivity. He called it the subliminal threshold. In simpler terms, children are bridges. Their minds are open enough to sense what adults are conditioned to ignore. They feel what grown minds filter out. And in rare cases, like Charles, that sensitivity might not just detect, but amplify. Harrison expanded this idea into a working hypothesis. A sensitive child's presence may enhance the visibility of entities in photographs. Their emotional connection could act like a tuning fork, bringing frequencies into range. Not just for the child, but for the camera too. He didn't say it was fact, only that the pattern was consistent enough to ask the question. Later studies would explore this idea further, even incorporating early psychological theories from Freud and Jung. Some believed it was imagination. Others argued it was early empathy or hallucination. But none of those could explain what appeared on chemically treated glass, or why, as Charles grew older, Arthur began to fade. Around the age of 10, the whispers stopped. The photographs no longer showed a sixth figure. And Charles, when asked, would simply say, "He's gone quiet now." Perhaps Arthur had said all he needed to say. Or perhaps Charles had simply stepped across the threshold, into the adult world where the unseen no longer speaks. By the time Charles Ashworth turned 70, the photograph that had once haunted his childhood had become a historical artifact, passed down through generations, quietly protected like a family secret. In 1965, Charles donated the original Ashworth portrait, along with Harrison's notes, Margaret's diaries, and Meyer's full report, to the Society for Psychical Research in London. He believed others should study it, not to prove ghosts were real, but to understand what had happened. And they did. Over the next 5 decades, that single photograph, a 30-second exposure taken in 1891, would be examined more thoroughly than almost any image of its time. In the 1970s, under ultraviolet light, researchers confirmed what Harrison had claimed. The sixth figure was embedded in the original collodion emulsion. It was not added later. It was not scratched in. It had been developed with the others. In the 1980s, spectroscopic analysis showed something even stranger. The 5 family members reflected natural light from the room's windows. But Arthur's figure? He was illuminated from a slightly different angle, suggesting a light source that didn't exist in the room. The idea of a second exposure was ruled out. Why? Because a second exposure would still follow the same light path. But this didn't. In the 1990s, digital processing revealed subtle details in Arthur's appearance. His shirt had fabric textures consistent with 1860s tailoring. His facial features matched the parish record sketch of Arthur Petton, a match that would later be validated by forensic facial mapping. No known editing techniques from the 19th century could explain the image. None. Even under high-resolution scans in the 2000s, the image remained consistent, untampered, and impossible. And most haunting of all, when image contrast was digitally enhanced, something new emerged. Arthur's eyes were not just visible. They had reflections. Reflections of the room, of the people, of Charles. As if, during those 30 seconds in October 1891, Arthur had not just appeared. He had been there, watching, aware. The image has never been disproven. And to this day, it sits quietly in a climate-controlled archive in London, sealed behind glass, labeled simply, "The Ashworth Portrait Glass Plate Number 6, Anomaly Present." Not every photograph captures a ghost, but some images refuse to fade. For over 130 years, the Ashworth portrait has been studied, debated, dissected, and still no one can explain the sixth figure. Not fully, not comfortably. Science has tested it. Technology has scanned it. But logic can only take us so far. Perhaps the most unsettling part of this story is not the presence of Arthur, but how naturally he was accepted. By Charles, by Margaret, by the silence in the house that no longer felt empty. Maybe children see what we've forgotten how to feel. Maybe the world is filled with things that exist just beyond our perception, waiting for a moment, a flash, a child, or a camera to be seen. Or maybe the truth is simpler and far more frightening. Some ghosts don't want to haunt. They just don't want to be forgotten. And if Arthur's story teaches us anything, it's that memory, even when buried under decades of dust and disbelief, has a way of returning. So, the next time you look at an old photo, ask yourself, who else might be in the frame? If stories like this intrigue you, don't let them vanish. Subscribe to Grave of the Shadows for more mysteries that challenge the seen and the known. Comment below. Do you believe the camera captured a ghost? Or something else? History is full of shadows. Here we shine a light on them,